On a stifling July night in 1860, Reverend Caleb Harrow vanished from his locked study in Savannah's grandest cathedral, leaving behind only a blood-smeared prayer book and a cryptic note that read, "The flock demands its offering. The pact must be kept." For over a century and a half, the Savannah diocese has guarded the true details of his disappearance, sealed away in hidden vaults. But newly unearthed correspondence has unveiled a conspiracy, so chilling it threatened to unravel the very fabric of Georgia's high society. What befell the man who preached to governors and cotton barons was far darker than anyone could have fathomed. The investigation that followed was deliberately thwarted. Witnesses vanished or met untimely ends, and evidence was systematically erased by Savannah's most influential families. Savannah in 1860 was a glittering gem of the antebellum South. Its oak-lined squares were framed by opulent mansions housing some of the wealthiest families in the region. The city's prosperity rested on cotton, indigo, and the grim engine of slavery, fostering a society where reputation was paramount, and a single misstep could spell ruin. The scent of gardenias and live oaks barely concealed the grim odor of the slave markets, while the chime of cathedral bells vied with the shouts of auctioneers trading in human lives. St. Augustine's Cathedral stood imposingly on Bull Street, its Romanesque towers casting long shadows over the humid air. Built in 1852 with donations from Savannah's elite, the cathedral was a monument to their power. The Calhouns, who dominated the cotton trade, the Lowells, whose legal dynasty shaped Georgia's laws, and the Draytons, whose political reach extended to the capital. These families wielded influence over not just vast estates worked by enslaved hands, but the very heartbeat of Southern commerce and governance. Within the cathedral's walls, deals were brokered that swayed state elections, marriages were arranged to cement fortunes, and secrets were buried deeper than the graves in its ancient churchyard. Pews were assigned by rigid social order, the front for families with colonial pedigrees, the middle for merchants and professionals, and the rear for those of lesser standing. Reverend Caleb Harrow arrived in Savannah 3 years prior, in 1857, from Wilmington, North Carolina, armed with glowing credentials and endorsements from prominent Tidewater families. His abrupt departure from St. James's Church in Wilmington had been shrouded in vague rumors of a scandal involving a merchant's daughter, though the Wilmington diocese was quick to secure him a new post far from North Carolina. At 40, Harrow was a striking figure, tall, with piercing green eyes and a mane of dark hair streaked with gray, lending him an air of seasoned authority. His voice, rich with the polished tones of Carolina gentry, carried a quiet intensity that seemed to pierce the hearts of his listeners. His sermons filled St. Augustine's to overflowing, with carriages clogging Abercorn Street. Governors postponed meetings to attend, and families traveled from as far as Augusta to hear him. His eloquence was matched by an uncanny ability to address the spiritual voids of his flock. But Harrow was more than a preacher. Within months, he had become a confidant to Savannah's elite, the keeper of their gravest sins. In the seclusion of his study, behind heavy oak doors and shuttered windows, the city's most powerful men confessed truths that could shatter their carefully curated lives. Dr. Nathaniel Forsyth, a descendant of one of Georgia's founding families and a renowned surgeon, was among Harrow's most frequent visitors. Forsyth owned a flourishing medical practice and several discreet enterprises, including a shadowy establishment on River Street catering to the vices of wealthy men. His wife, Eleanor, a refined woman of impeccable lineage, remained ignorant of his hidden dealings. Judge Marcus Wentworth, whose rulings could elevate or ruin families, also sought Harrow's counsel. Known for his unyielding integrity, Wentworth privately grappled with debts from opium addiction that threatened his family's legacy. His visits to Harrow's study were as routine as Sunday Mass. Senator William Tarrant, a towering figure in Southern politics and a staunch defender of states' rights, was seen slipping into the cathedral at odd hours, his demeanor that of a man guarding perilous secrets. His political career hinged on his moral image, but rumors in Savannah's parlors hinted at compromises that would horrify even his most jaded allies. The summer of 1860 was brutal, with yellow fever looming and tensions over slavery's expansion into the territories reaching a boiling point. The air was thick with dread, as families fled to their mountain retreats, and those who stayed whispered of omens. Street vendors noted their customers' growing unease, flinching at every sudden noise. July 19, 1860, dawned oppressively, with heat radiating from the Savannah River and blanketing the city. By midday, the temperature had climbed to 96 degrees Fahrenheit, and even the bustling factor's walk fell silent as people sought refuge from the relentless sun. Stray dogs panted in the shade, and the city's iconic wrought iron railings were too hot to touch. Reverend Caldwell had spent the morning in his study, preparing for evening vespers and meeting with parishioners seeking his guidance. Margaret Hensley, the church secretary who had served Street Bartholomew for 15 years, noticed he seemed unusually preoccupied, frequently checking an ornate silver pocket watch gifted to him by an unknown benefactor the previous Easter. The watch bore an inscription in Latin that Margaret could never decipher, though she observed Caldwell often touched it during moments of deep thought. Throughout the day, a steady stream of Charleston's elite visited the church, each requesting private audiences with Caldwell. Margaret noted these meetings differed from his usual pastoral sessions. The visitors arrived anxious and left even more disturbed. Tobias Wentworth, a cotton merchant with trade ties from Charleston to London, emerged from one such meeting, his face pale and hands shaking so much he struggled to light his usual pipe. As the sun dipped toward the Ashley River, casting long shadows across the churchyard filled with the graves of Charleston's founding families, Caldwell dismissed Margaret earlier than usual. "I have pressing matters to attend to this evening," he told her, his voice carrying an unfamiliar quiver that chilled her despite the heavy heat. "Please ensure I'm not disturbed under any circumstances. Lock the main doors behind you and inform anyone who inquires that the church is closed for private reflection." Margaret, with her years at the church, sensed something was deeply wrong. Caldwell's usual calm had given way to barely contained agitation, his hands trembling slightly as he shuffled papers on his desk. Most unsettlingly, he had spent several minutes staring at a daguerreotype photograph kept locked in his desk drawer. She had glimpsed it once, 13 men in formal attire, standing around what appeared to be an altar. At 7:30, as the church bells rang across the city, calling the faithful to evening prayers at other parishes, 3 men arrived at St. Bartholomew. Margaret, lingering in the vestry to finish filing correspondence, recognized them through the Gothic windows: Dr. Langley, Judge Harrow, and cotton merchant Tobias Wentworth. All 3 were prominent vestry members, pillars of Charleston society whose families had helped build the church. Tonight, their faces bore a mix of resolve and barely concealed dread, transforming their usual confidence into something almost secretive. Dr. Langley kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting pursuit, while Judge Harrow clutched a leather satchel so tightly his knuckles whitened. Wentworth muttered prayers under his breath, his lips moving in silent pleas. They entered Caldwell's study without acknowledging Margaret, and the heavy oak door closed with a finality that echoed through the empty church like a death knell. For the next hour and a half, Margaret heard the low murmur of intense conversation, occasionally punctuated by raised voices carrying an urgency unlike any church business she knew. Around 8:40, she distinctly heard Dr. Langley shout, "You cannot demand this of us, Nathaniel. Not after all we've built. Not after all we've sacrificed to reach this moment." The response was muffled, but Caldwell's tone carried a coldness that made Margaret's blood run cold despite the stifling humidity. She caught fragments. "The covenant requires fulfillment. The price was agreed upon. Your souls are already bound." Judge Harrow's voice rose next, breaking with desperation. "There must be another way. Surely the Lord would not require such a sacrifice from his faithful." Caldwell's laughter in response was chilling, devoid of warmth, echoing from some dark place within him. The discussion grew more heated, with Wentworth's voice joining in. "The yellow fever has already claimed dozens. Can't we say it was the plague? No one would question another death from fever." But Caldwell's reply was unyielding. "The covenant dictates the manner and time. No substitutions, no delays, no mercy for the faint-hearted." At 9:15, the study door opened, and the 3 men emerged into the candlelit church, their faces ashen, their movements unsteady. Judge Harrow's hands shook so violently he dropped several matches before lighting his pipe with a weak flame. Wentworth kept glancing back at the study door, as if expecting something horrific to follow, repeatedly making the sign of the cross in a protective gesture. Dr. Langley approached Margaret with forced composure, but she noticed perspiration on his brow despite the evening's slight cooling, and his usually pristine clothing was disheveled. His medical bag seemed heavier than usual, as if carrying more than his standard instruments. "Miss Hensley," he said, his voice steady but with an underlying tremor, "Reverend Caldwell will be working late on matters of grave spiritual importance. He's asked not to be disturbed under any circumstances. Go home now, and ensure no one enters the church until morning service." His tone brooked no argument, but his eyes avoided hers, his words sounding rehearsed. As the three men departed into the Charleston night, their carriage wheels echoing on the cobblestones, Margaret felt a heavy dread settle over the church like a tangible presence. The gas lamps flickered, casting shadows that seemed to writhe with malevolent life across the Gothic arches and religious frescoes that usually offered solace. She waited another 30 minutes, her anxiety mounting, before mustering the courage to check on Caldwell. The study door was locked, but light seeped beneath it, accompanied by the sound of turning pages and a pen scratching on paper. Occasionally, she heard what might have been prayer, but in a language she didn't recognize, neither Latin nor English, but something dark that made her skin crawl. Pressing her ear to the door, she heard Caldwell's voice rise and fall in what sounded like an incantation, punctuated by long silences. At one point, she thought she heard other voices responding, though she knew he was alone. The air near the door felt unnaturally cold, as if something drained the warmth from the surroundings. Something was terribly wrong. Margaret Hensley knew that whatever was unfolding in that locked study would alter Charleston forever. The next morning confirmed the city's worst fears, though the full horror would remain hidden for decades. When Clara arrived at St. Augustine's for the morning service preparations, she found the vicar's study locked from the inside, with no answer to her persistent knocking. The sexton, Elias Grant, a weathered man who had tended the church in Savannah for over 35 years and held keys to every lock, was called to unravel the enigma behind the sealed door. Elias had witnessed much in his decades serving Savannah's prominent families, but nothing could have braced him for the sight that awaited when the heavy walnut door creaked open. The study was devoid of life, yet the scene within would linger in Savannah's memory for generations, haunting Clara and Elias until their final days, burdened with secrets too grim to reveal. Reverend Hawthorne was gone, as if he had never been. The manner of his disappearance defied reason, logic, and the laws of nature. The windows were sealed shut, their iron shutters firmly latched with no signs of disturbance. The door they had just unlocked was the only entrance and exit, secured from within, with the key now resting on Hawthorne's desk beside a tableau that made Clara's heart lurch. On the oak desk, Hawthorne's Bible lay open, its pages marred with what looked like fresh blood, still glistening despite the night that had passed. The crimson marks formed deliberate patterns, as if someone had used the blood to highlight verses about atonement, divine promises, and the cost of sacred authority. Next to the Bible, in Hawthorne's precise handwriting, but in an ink that matched the blood's dark hue, was a note that chilled Clara to her core. The flock demands its offering. The pact must be upheld. The 13 are now 12, but the mission endures. The room itself bore signs of a ritualistic act. Every drawer in Hawthorne's grand desk was pulled out and emptied, not in disarray but with meticulous order. Papers were stacked neatly on the Turkish rug, letters sorted by sender, ledgers arranged by type, and most unsettling, a circle of sealed envelopes, each bearing the name of one of Savannah's most influential families, arranged around the desk chair. At the circle's center, where the chair should have stood, was a dark stain on the rug, unmistakably blood, as Elias recognized instantly. The volume was far too great for anyone to survive such a loss, and the stain formed a perfect circle, as if someone had stood there, willingly letting their lifeblood pool in a ceremonial act. On the bookshelf behind the desk, ritualistic items were carefully arranged. A silver goblet from the church's communion set sat beside an unfamiliar dagger with a blade stained in the same dark substance as the Bible and rug. Its ebony handle was etched with strange, intricate symbols neither Clara nor Elias could decipher. The investigation that followed was swift, cursory, and shrouded in interference from powers beyond Savannah's borders. Judge Harlan took charge, insisting the matter required discretion due to the sensitive nature of the Reverend's duties and the privacy of his pastoral counsel. Dr. Mayhew, despite his ties to the church, served as the medical examiner, though there was no body to inspect. The official report, delivered with unsettling haste, claimed Reverend Hawthorne had succumbed to a mental collapse, triggered by the humid Savannah summers and the weight of ministering to the city's elite during turbulent times. The blood on the Bible was dismissed as the result of a severe nosebleed from stress and heat exhaustion, while his disappearance was attributed to an urgent family matter in Maryland, requiring immediate and confidential attention. The story fed to the Savannah Gazette was even more sanitized. Reverend Hawthorne had left abruptly to tend to his ailing father in Baltimore, with his belongings to be sent later and a new reverend appointed soon. The church would operate normally under the vestry's interim leadership. But those closest to the events knew a darker truth lingered. Elias Grant, who had seen the study's horrors, whispered to his daughter that the vestry members seemed gripped by fear in the weeks that followed. Dr. Mayhew's robust frame seemed to wither, his once dark hair turning ashen in days. Judge Harlan, previously a model of restraint, was seen wandering the waterfront at dawn, muttering about debts paid and pacts sealed. Clara Dunham, after a decade of loyal service, was urged to take an extended leave to recover from the shock. When she tried to return, she found her role filled by a young woman from Augusta, instructed never to mention Clara or inquire about the church's recent past. The three men who had met with Hawthorne that final night, Dr. Mayhew, Judge Harlan, and Merchant Theodore Vaughn, soon found urgent reasons to leave Savannah, despite their deep ties to the city. Dr. Mayhew sold his practice at a loss and moved to Charleston, citing his wife's need for a milder climate. Judge Harlan retired abruptly, claiming a desire to retreat to his family's estate in Alabama, leaving critical legal matters unresolved. Theodore Vaughn's exit was the most dramatic. He liquidated his shipping empire, a fortune built over generations, for a pittance and vanished, with rumors suggesting he fled to Mexico or the Caribbean, leaving his family to face creditors and unanswered questions. As months passed, St. Augustine's and its surroundings grew plagued by eerie occurrences. The new reverend, a timid young man named Samuel Holt from Virginia, spoke of feeling watched during his sermons, as though unseen eyes scrutinized his every word. Some secrets, William Carver warned Eliza Mayhew, his voice heavy with the burden of shielding Savannah's elite, are too perilous to unearth. Her grandfather and his associates were long dead, their victims beyond justice, their sins beyond atonement. Let their crimes die with them, he urged, or risk ruining innocents who bear no guilt for their ancestors' deeds. But Eliza, driven by a moral resolve her grandfather lacked, refused to let the past stay buried. Despite Carver's cautions and her family's pleas, she insisted the documents be preserved for future reckoning. She entrusted them to the Savannah Historical Society, sealed for 50 years, believing truth, however horrific, demanded its day. Unbeknownst to Eliza, the papers from her grandfather's mansion were only a fragment of Reverend Hawthorne's dark legacy. Her decision to preserve them sparked a chain of revelations, exposing the Order of the Veil as just the beginning of a malevolent conspiracy that had infected Savannah's elite like a spiritual contagion. In 1894, 3 years after Eliza's discovery, construction of a new civic hall on the site of Savannah's old cotton exchange uncovered evidence that confirmed the darkest implications of the Mayhew documents. The exchange had been shuttered since 1865, left to decay in Savannah's humid air until the city opted to raise it for a new municipal building. Workers excavating the foundation discovered that the exchange was merely the surface of a far larger complex. Beneath the trading floor lay a network of subterranean chambers, hewn from bedrock and bricked with precision, unlike any storage rooms expected beneath a commercial site. These chambers bore signs of recent use, despite the exchange's closure 30 years prior. Walls were stained with what seasoned workers recognized as blood, not mere traces from accidents, but volumes suggesting deliberate violence. Iron manacles hung from bolts embedded in the stone, their surfaces polished by the struggles of countless captives. In the deepest chamber, personal effects sent shudders through the investigation team, confirming the fears raised by the Mayhew papers. Among them was a silver pocket watch engraved with the initials J.H. and the Latin phrase Tempus Mortis, time of death. Elderly parishioners identified it as the watch Reverend Hawthorne checked obsessively in his final days. A communion chalice from St. Augustine's, its surface marred with unidentifiable substances, was also found, alongside a collection of tintype photographs depicting 13 men in ceremonial robes encircling an altar crafted from human bones. Savannah's response was swift, decisive, and orchestrated from the highest echelons. Mayor Charles Wentworth, whose family name appeared in the Mayhew documents, ordered the chambers filled with concrete before a thorough investigation could proceed. Construction was rushed, and within 6 months, the new Savannah Civic Hall stood atop the buried secrets. But the workers were not bound to silence, and rumors spread through Savannah's working-class districts with the ferocity of a summer fever. Tales grew darker with each retelling, as laborers shared their findings with kin, who whispered to neighbors, until the city buzzed with suppressed horror. Patrick O'Connell, an Irish bricklayer who helped uncover the chambers, turned to drink after the discovery, squandering his wages in waterfront taverns. There, he recounted chilling details to anyone who'd listen. 13 bodies, he'd slur, hands trembling as he lit a cigarette, black and white, laid out in a perfect circle around that cursed altar, like they were part of some unholy prayer. It wasn't no Christian rite, O'Connell would insist, his voice thick with whiskey and dread. The way they were placed, the things done to them before death, it was straight from hell's depths. His most haunting claim, which eerily echoed the Mayhew documents, was that the 13 bodies formed a circle around a central figure in a cleric's black robes. "But here's what'll haunt me till I'm dust," he'd whisper, leaning close to his listeners. "That preacher wasn't slaughtered like the rest. No, he died smiling, hands clasped in prayer, as if welcoming whatever demon came for his soul. And the dagger, God help us, it was still in his own hands." O'Connell's account mirrored the Order of the Veil's roster, 13 members, with Hawthorne as their leader. His tale suggested something beyond murder, that Hawthorne had orchestrated his own death as the final act of a dark pact with forces beyond comprehension. Had he coerced 12 of Savannah's elite into participating in his ritual demise? Were they willing accomplices or victims of his manipulative schemes? If the chambers held evidence of years of systematic killings, how many of Savannah's missing, slaves, immigrants, and poor whites, had fallen to the Order's rituals? As O'Connell's stories spread through Savannah's networks of dockhands, servants, and free blacks, who had long suspected a sinister undercurrent beneath the city's refined veneer, a chilling pattern emerged. St. Augustine's. Records from 1853, the year the order was founded, showed significant donations for a special outreach to Savannah's downtrodden, overseen by Hawthorne and a committee including Dr. Mayhew, Judge Harlan, and Theodore Vaughan. The program claimed to aid runaway slaves, destitute Irish immigrants, and others on society's fringes, with detailed ledgers suggesting a robust charitable effort. Yet city records painted a grim counterpoint. During this period, disappearances among these groups surged. Police reports, rarely pursued due to the victims' low status, documented dozens of cases fitting a disturbing mold. Young adults, aged 18 to 30, male and female, with no ties strong enough to demand justice. Runaway slaves, Irish newcomers, free blacks without papers, and poor whites vanished without ripple. Many were last seen with well-dressed men claiming to offer aid from charitable groups. In the shadowed heart of Savannah, Georgia, whispers of a sinister covenant lingered among the city's oldest families. Witnesses described the benefactors as polished, erudite men who carried themselves with the confidence of those used to wielding power. Such descriptions could have fit any of Savannah's elite, including the known members of Reverend Alistair Blackwood's secretive pact. The chilling pattern emerged when investigators cross-referenced the dates of mysterious disappearances with a ritual calendar discovered among the Harrington family papers. Each vanishing aligned precisely with what Blackwood had marked as sacred duties or holy labors, hinting that the missing were deliberately chosen for rituals conducted in hidden chambers beneath the city's historic market. Dr. Heinrich Voss, a Prussian physician who settled in Savannah in 1854 to serve its indigent population, grew increasingly alarmed by the pattern. In letters to his sister in Berlin, Voss confided his suspicions of something far darker than ordinary crime. "The missing share traits that suggest careful selection," he wrote in November 1855. "They are young, healthy, and without ties that would prompt thorough investigations. Worse, several of my patients spoke of being approached by representatives of supposed charitable groups that I cannot confirm exist. I fear Savannah's veneer of piety masks appetites far more malevolent than greed." Voss's fears proved tragically prescient when he vanished in March 1856, mere months before Blackwood's own disappearance. His body was never recovered, though his medical satchel washed ashore in the Savannah River, accompanied by a note claiming despair over his inability to aid his patients had driven him to suicide. Those who knew Voss, a man of unwavering faith and resolve, dismissed this explanation. He had often spoken of his duty to the forgotten, making such an act unthinkable. The final key to the mystery surfaced in 1902, through the deathbed confession of Jeremiah Holt, a former night watchman at Savannah's Old Market. Ravaged by consumption and guilt, Holt summoned Father Michael O'Connor, a priest who ministered to the city's poor, to unburden his soul of secrets kept for nearly half a century. "Father," Holt rasped, his voice faint amid the groans of the charity ward, "I've carried the devil's truths too long. It's time the light sees them, even if it damns me." Holt's confession, delivered over 3 agonizing nights, shattered any illusions about Blackwood's disappearance. The Reverend had not vanished mysteriously, but had died by his own design in a ritual meant to bind his followers through shared guilt and spiritual corruption. In 1855, Dr. Elias Harrington had approached Holt with an offer of $50 a month, a fortune for a watchman, to grant access to the market's underground chambers at night and ensure no one witnessed what transpired. Holt, desperate to support his sickly wife and educate his children, accepted, believing the space was used for illicit slave trading, a grim but common practice he could justify for the money. The truth was far worse. From early 1855 until Blackwood's death in September 1856, Holt witnessed the ritualistic torture and murder of at least 40 victims in those subterranean chambers. The ceremonies grew increasingly elaborate and horrific, with participants cloaked in black robes and masks. Holt, tasked with unlocking the market, recognized some by their habits. Dr. Harrington by his medical bag, Judge Amos Langley by his leather-bound ledger, and Merchant Tobias Crane by his case of ritual tools. Blackwood himself orchestrated each rite, arriving last in robes adorned with strange symbols, clutching a book from which he chanted in tongues that seemed to warp the air itself. The rituals were acts of calculated depravity. Victims were prepared according to Blackwood's precise instructions, some tortured for days, others killed swiftly but with wounds following patterns from his unholy text. They weren't just killing, Holt whispered to Father O'Connor, his eyes haunted. They were taking something not of flesh but deeper, making the air heavy with evil. Blackwood collected victims' blood in silver chalices, forcing his followers to drink, binding them to his dark purpose. The final ritual on September 22, 1856, was unlike any other. Instead of an external victim, Blackwood himself became the sacrifice. He stood willingly at an altar built from the bones of prior victims, delivering a sermon that twisted Christian doctrine into a promise of eternal dominion over Savannah, contingent on his followers' obedience. 12 demons, Holt murmured, his strength fading. He said his death would tie their souls to his forever, granting them power if they wielded the blade. Holt watched as the 12 Covenant members took turns plunging a ceremonial dagger into Blackwood's heart, each strike accompanied by words that shook the chamber. Blackwood smiled through it all, his final words a chilling vow. Through my death, you gain eternity. Through my sacrifice, you rise above God's laws. We are bound by blood and shadow until time's end. The Covenant disposed of Blackwood's body among the others, arranging them in patterns matching the chamber's carved symbols, then dispersed, never reuniting but forever linked by their crimes. Holt's journal, hidden in his tenement's walls and later recovered by Father O'Connor, detailed every ritual, victim, and participant, naming all 13 members of Blackwood's pact. Father O'Connor faced a tormenting choice. Exposing the journal would ruin powerful families whose descendants still held sway in Savannah. Instead, he sent it to the Catholic Church's archives in Baltimore, sealed for 50 years, and quietly investigated the Covenant's surviving families. His findings confirmed Holt's account. The families had prospered unnaturally, but at a terrible cost. The Harringtons built a pharmaceutical empire, but were plagued by suicides aligning with Blackwood's ritual dates. Langley's legal dynasty produced influential judges, yet succumbed to alcoholism and inexplicable deaths on September 22nd. Crane's merchant fortune spanned continents, but his descendants vanished mysteriously around their 30th birthdays. Private diaries revealed a hereditary curse of guilt and terror. Elias Harrington III, who died by suicide in 1904, wrote of inherited memories. The sins of our fathers bind us to a covenant we never chose. I see the chambers, smell the blood, hear the screams and dreams not my. Physicians noted spiritual trauma in these families, with symptoms of night terrors and religious phobias persisting across generations. By 1915, many Covenant lines had ended through suicide, disappearances, or undiagnosed illnesses. Survivors fled Savannah, changing their names to escape the curse. The chambers beneath Savannah's market remain unexcavated, sealed under concrete and willful amnesia. Yet, disappearances among the city's vulnerable continued sporadically, suggesting Blackwood's legacy endured, perhaps through imitators or some lingering malevolence. Tourists visiting the market today report eerie sensations, cold spots, whispers in unknown tongues, and a sense of being watched by something hungry. Night guards speak of ceremonial chants and visions of robed figures, some quitting after unbearable nightmares. On humid September nights, Savannah's historic district echoes with faint, unnatural sounds, prayers, scraping metal, and laughter that seems to rise from hell itself, as if Alistair Blackwood still conducts his dark rites from beyond. This tale reveals how the pursuit of power can birth evils that haunt generations, binding descendants to uncommitted sins. The true horror lies not in the murders, but in the spiritual corruption that cursed entire bloodlines with madness and death, proving more enduring than any wealth gained through blood. What do you think of this story? Do darker secrets still lurk beneath Savannah's charm? Have you felt something unexplainable in a historic place, hinting at forgotten tragedies? Share your thoughts, and if you crave more mysteries, stay tuned for another dive into America's hidden past. The past never fades, it waits to resurface, reminding us some sins are too vast to forgive, and some evils too potent to ever die.